What is going on, everybody? If you've clicked on this video, you're probably trying to make sure your players are not on this list, and lucky for you, I'm going to be giving you guys a list of players we need to be sitting this week in fantasy football at all costs. And you guys know I hate to waste people's time in these videos, so the first one here for week 7 is George Pickens, and this is for some pretty strong reasons. The number one being Diontae Johnson is back, officially ruled in for this game, and he was trending towards being ready last week, but they had their bye. Now he gets even more time to be ready and prepare for his full workload. He's not really going to be restricted. But the reason I say this is because Diontae Johnson is going to take a number out of George Pickens' volume. The Steelers' offense is already one of the worst, if not the worst offenses in the entire NFL. They can't stay on the field. They can't move the ball. Their offense ranks dead last in the league. They're 31st in passing touchdowns. They're 30th in pass attempts per game, and pretty much last in every single metric. I'm not going to just read it off to you guys because we'd be here for 20 minutes. And speaking of fantasy points, if you're not on the field, you're not getting them, especially in a Matt Canada-led offense. But the real interesting thing here is that George Pickens has averaged a 23% team target share throughout the entirety of the season and a 41% air yard share. And you might be looking at these numbers and be like, cool, big numbers. What does that even mean? Those numbers put him with receivers like Adam Thielen, DK Metcalf, and Amari Cooper, who are all way better and more consistent than him, which means he's severely underperforming on his target volume. Despite having a positive target volume throughout the entirety of this season, he's still been extremely boom or bust. And if you have him on your team, you can tell, but if you look at his chart, he's either been the wide receiver 5 or the wide receiver 40. And now that we have Diontae Johnson back in this offense, it is going to severely lower his floor and his ceiling each week. And it seems like some people are kind of underestimating Diontae Johnson's role in this offense and how much targets he's really going to get. In week 1.5 of football before he got injured, he got 6 targets and he had the most yardage last season without a touchdown. He gets the volume. He is the number one guy. And now with George Pickens falling into the second option on this team for targets, even maybe third behind Pat Freiermuth when he's healthy, on top of an offense that is last in all passing stats, they now get a really tough matchup against the Rams pass defense, which allowed the 5th least points to fantasy wide receivers on the season. He's going to be very boomer bust. I'm not going to trust him this week. Let's wait and see what this offense looks like while Diontae Johnson is back. And for that matter, everybody on this offense is back. And then we can make the assumption on what we want to do with Pickens there. But real quick, if you guys have made it this far in the video, make sure to like it up and maybe even subscribe if you haven't already and you're enjoying the video. It would mean a lot to me, but it would mean more to your fantasy teams to get these videos every day. But the next guy we need to be sitting on our bench, and he's more of a flex guy, but I've seen a whole lot of people start to hype him up again. I don't understand it. I don't know why we keep doing this. Is Kendrick Bourne. I thought that we've learned week in and week out that we can't trust this Patriots offense, and just because he has one game that is pretty good doesn't mean he's all of a sudden a consistent flex guy. He got the same hype in week 1 after he scored 24 points. He's gonna get big games every once in a while. It's just something that he does. He's always done it for years in this Patriots offense, but never yet has he been startable, and this is exactly what I've been saying since week 1. And I get it. He came out last week and had 10 receptions, almost 100 yards. It's kind of hard to sit him after he does something like that. But if we take out the 2 boom weeks that are way above his projections, in week 1 and 6, he's averaged 3 receptions a game. And that's probably what he's going to see this week against the Bills defense that ranked 10th in wide receiver points allowed this season. If you've been smacked with injuries or bye weeks, I get you might reach him to start him in your lineups. If you absolutely have to, you can do it. Juju might miss this week, but if you have other options you can start, don't do it unless you have to. But moving on to another guy that everybody is starting this week, and again, we have to temper our expectations here, is Zach Evans. Yes, Kyren Williams is ruled out for this week's matchup and possibly for the next few weeks in the future, but Sean McVay has been extremely hesitant in naming him the starter, and let me explain why. The Rams just brought up Royce Freeman to be the RB2 slated for this week, and they just signed Myles Gaskin, and they signed all of these running backs because there's no Ronnie Rivers this week. But this all shows that they clearly don't trust Zach Evans to take the majority of the Kyren Williams role. This is most definitely going to be a 50-30-20 split between all of these running backs in the backfield and create a complete committee. And you know what? That might actually be even worse because they just elevated Darrell Henderson onto this team, so they have 4 running backs now. If the coaching staff doesn't trust him, or at least doesn't want him to see a bulk of these carries, we can't either. Do not be blindsided just because he's the RB1 this week. You got to be aware of the other circumstances. We also have to be aware that Zach Evans is a terrible pass protector, which limits his usage on third down, which limits his usage in the receiving game, and not being on the field just for that little amount of snaps is going to completely undercut his volume and receiving upside. But if you absolutely have to start him this week, he does get a decent matchup against the Pittsburgh run defense. They could possibly go up and use the running game more, but if it's a 4-man committee, I'm staying away from it. The next guy we need to be cutting ties with this week and should have sold weeks ago, if you still have him on your team, do not consider starting him now. It is Zack Moss. Yes, Jonathan Taylor is back and he's been increasing his snaps every single week. He saw 15% of the snaps in week 1 and then all the way to 40% in week 2, and that should continue. He's probably going to see 60 to 70% of the snaps this week. But JT coming back isn't the main reason why I'm telling you to sit Zack Moss. Obviously, Zack Moss's snap share took a huge hit from 80 to 50% with JT coming back back, and that's only going to continue. I mean, he's a top running back in the league in his prime, but we got to be sitting Moss because the matchup he gets is terrible against the Cleveland Browns defense, who's been one of the best in the league. Just some stats here for you I'm going to list off. They allow the second least rushing yards to opposing running backs. They only allow 79 yards a game in total to all running backs, not just the starter, and Zack Moss has been losing usage by the week. He gets a terrible matchup. The Colts will probably have a more pass-heavy scheme. He's got a low floor, a low ceiling. This is a place I'm looking to sit him everywhere I can. But speaking of sitting somebody everywhere we can, Courtland Sutton needs to be on all benches, and let's look into why. This is a really interesting stat here. Courtland Sutton has been the wide receiver 31 through the course of the entire season, and you might think, wow, I mean, that's not too bad for where we drafted him at, right? Wrong. Courtland Sutton, despite being the wide receiver 31 on the season, has had 4 touchdowns, which makes him tied for the 3rd most touchdowns in the NFL. If you think Courtland Sutton is on the level of Tyreek Hill, Keenan Allen, or Stephon Diggs in touchdown upside, or even any upside in general, you have to be on something. Touchdowns for wide receivers are the most random, volatile stat you can get, and a lot of his touchdowns came in garbage time of these games, so they haven't been valuable and they're not really predictable like Tyreek Hill or Stephon Diggs would be, because they have an insanely high target volume already and they get used in the red zone. If we took out all 4 touchdowns in the 6 weeks he's had, he would be scoring single-digit fantasy points average on the year. But outside him outperforming his statistical averages, he gets a tough matchup against the Packers defense, who rank 5th in wide receiver points allowed on the perimeter, and that is where Courtland Sutton plays a majority of his snaps. The Packers also have Jair Alexander off the injury report ready to go this week, and he's going to be on Courtland Sutton the majority of this game. Courtland Sutton has been very bad in negative matchups so far this year. He averages 2 receptions in those matchups, and there is also the possibility that this is a slower paced game. A lot of teams run on the Broncos. They are a run funnel. Their run defense is absolutely atrocious, and if you're running the ball, it's going to be a slower paced game, and you're going to have less time on the field, which means less opportunity for fantasy points. I'm just not in love with anything to do with Courtland Sutton in this offense this week. I'm sitting him. You should be sitting him everywhere you can. But the next guy we need to be sitting on our bench is Alexander Mattison. The main reason for this is because he gets a terrible matchup again against the 49ers defense. They allow the 10th least fantasy points a game to opposing running backs on the season, and they also only allow 60 rushing yards in total to every running back every game. Not to mention the Vikings' new addition of running back Cam Akers. Now, yes, he hasn't been a huge factor so far this season and probably won't be this week either, but if he continues to see a 30% snap share and 5 or 6 carries a game, it's gonna feed into Alexander Madison's value just a little bit, and any value is important value when you're playing the 49ers defense. But the Vikings team in general collectively has been very bad, especially without Justin Jefferson, and that's not good for the running backs, because in a game where they're going to be playing from behind, it's less rushing opportunity. Again, if you're on the field less, there's less opportunity for fantasy points, and the 49ers are just solid on defense and offense. If we're starting Mattison, we're hoping for a very big receiving game. Probably 5 or 6 receptions is what you're going to need for him to be startable and a positive start this week. But that's just not a good bet. He hasn't been efficient on the ground either, despite all of the good matchups he's had so far. So again, terrible matchup. Akers is coming back and not much time on the field. The offense and defense for the Vikings looks terrible, and when your defense is allowing 30 points a game, you're going to have to pass a lot to stay in the games. Bad game script altogether. I'm sitting Mattison where I can. But moving over to a tight end that we need to be sitting this week, and one that has kind of been falling off recently, is Zach Ertz. The whole reason we were starting Zach Ertz in the beginning of the season is because he was a volume guy. It might not have been super valuable red zone or yards after the catch receptions, and the catches he made weren't really pretty, but it was the receiving floor that he had that was keeping us starting him every week. But now that floor that he had is going away. If we look at his chart here, he had 5 targets last week, 4 targets the week before that. Both of those performances were against very easy defenses against fantasy tight ends, and he's averaged 5 targets over the last 4 weeks. His volume has been falling off, and he's no longer a safe start. On top of his inconsistency, he's getting a terrible matchup against the Seahawks defense, who are 3rd in points allowed to the tight end position, and he's only projected 3 receptions this week. I think the Zach Ertz wave is dead, and it's officially time to start sitting him for good until he shows us otherwise. Not to mention, he has one of the hardest tight end schedules for the next 3 weeks, especially this week coming up. But that is going to finish off this video. If you guys did enjoy, I seriously appreciate you watching through, and I'll see you in the next videos after this week's games.